What's going on, guys? Rusty with GritShift. So we're going to do a little continuation. Josh obviously just recently did the video of how to quickly and easily remove your jack shaft to replace your front primary belt. This is kind of a continuation because on that video we had a couple questions about how do you actually remove your jack shaft bearings and replace them. So we're going to show you how to do it with just basic hand tools that you'll have laying around. Things you're going to need for this are going to be a 5mm Allen head. This is for removing the sprockets off of the jack shaft. You're going to need a flathead screwdriver. This is for getting the seals out of the actual jack shaft. A hammer. This is for getting the bearings out and back in. And you're going to need some sort of outer diameter that's going to match to the bearing. So if you see here, what you're really looking for is the OD of this matches the OD of the bearing. So you can see kind of like this, how it's almost the same exact size. No matter really which way you push it, it's hitting on this outer steel race right here. These actual bearings are 6000-2RS. You can find them almost anywhere, Amazon, anywhere that you can buy bearings really. Even local in-town shops usually stock these. So 6002RS. The jack shaft seals I do recommend replacing when you are going to do this since you already have them out. I don't have any with me today, so pardon me, I am not going to replace them today, but let's get into the process. First step for me is always going to be remove the sprockets. Alright, so now that you got the sprockets off the jack shaft, there are a couple things to note. I got lucky on this one. On your actual smaller sprocket for your rear drive, the seal and the spacer usually come out with it. It may not, but usually they do with the way they sit in the jack shaft. So I always like to make sure you keep these separate. These spacers are actually different. So pull these both out for you. If you look at this, this is going to be the sprocket for the rear drive. This is actually longer than the sprocket for the primary drive. You have to keep these separated. If you don't, your jack shaft will not line up correctly. What I do to do this is I always consider these pulleys. For some reason, I think a belt pulley. So with that, I always put a P. I just use a little Sharpie to put a P and an S down on my mat. Boom. Now I know that the P side, that is for that pulley side, and the S side is going to be for sprocket. Another thing to note while you're taking these off, I have all these bolts right here. The pulley or the sprocket, but the belt side drive is shorter of a bolt length than the sprocket side. You must keep these separated. If you do not, when you go to install them, you will have issues. Same thing I do with the other one. I go ahead and match them to where they need to go. More organized you are with this part of the process, the easier the install is going to be when you put it back together. Now that we have that done, really the only thing left is to pop out this seal. This is your seal for this bearing side. It's pretty easy. Any flathead, just be nice and easy. If it doesn't come out as easily as it did right there, I just put it underneath the initial lip and then pry it upwards. You may have to do it in a couple different spots so you don't damage this. It's very important to try not to damage it if you are going to be reusing it. So now you have your bank bare jack shaft. Well, it's kind of funny because nothing's on it. There is a couple things to note. There is an inner liner inside of here. So it's going to be hard to tell, but there is an inner sleeve. Almost like when you're doing your wheels. Your wheels in between the two bearings, there's going to be a sleeve in there. And that's to help make sure that you're not putting excess pressure inwards on the bearings. If you don't have that in there and you crank down on this and something is pushing on this hard enough, you will force this inner sleeve inwards and then you will have very horrible feeling bearings. So what we do to go ahead and get that kind of out of the way, just take a flathead, slight pry over. You can probably hear that click on the video. That's going to give you a little bit of room so that way you can get something in there to contact the lip of the bearing. That is really all you have to do from that point, and now we're going to start with heat. The most important part when you're heating this jack shaft for removing this, you don't have to overly heat it. A torch, a MAP gas, and a heat gun, anything like that will work. The most important thing though is you're trying to heat basically this. You can see where the lip sits, kind of starts tapering in on this side. Don't really see it on this side, but what you're trying to do is heat this. Just get a little expansion to break that basically push fit. That little bit of expanding of the aluminum is going to give you basically the little bit less resistance to be able to pop them out with these. So we're going to go ahead and start heating. shouldn't take too much heat to get it ready. Now that we're down to this, I'm just gonna try to start getting this thing to move. Now when you put your screwdriver in or whatever you're using to actually get these bearings out, it's important to try to set it right on that race edge, and that's gonna allow it to come out. Couple smacks of the hammer, it should be out. When you are doing this, you may have to rotate left and right. If you're only going on one side, you're only making contact on one side, it may actually start to try to sidewalk and make it hard to get out. So you may have to switch your positions a couple times. Be slow with it. It's not a race. Just give it light taps on each side and it should come out. And that one already started to move. This is that liner we were talking about that sits between two bearings. Basically what it does is rides right on the inner race and keeps it from having excess pressure from the outside, keeping your bearing life good, keeping them feeling right. Now what you see me using here is just one of our bearing cups. It really doesn't matter what you're gonna use when you actually go to hit the bearings out. Anything that really gonna sit on that Audi and allow you to have a little bit more play to get bearing out. Basically you don't want it sitting flush, because if it's flush and you're hitting something flush, bearing's not gonna move. So I just use one of our bearing cups. Gives me a little bit of room so that way I can get the bearings out. So now we got a nice clean bearing, or jack shaft, nice and empty. This is the time where, depending on how it looks, you may want to take the time to clean it. This is very hot, so I'm not gonna pick it up with my hands again, but you may start to get some grooves in here. You may have some dirt in here. Now's the time to clean it. Usually I would use a wire brush or something of that nature just to clean this groove out. Make sure when you go to install the new bearings, it's nice and easy. All right, so we let it cool down a little bit. Now I can actually touch it with my hand without wanting to scream like a little girl, so that's always nice. I'm gonna clean it real quick. Any really degreaser is gonna work. Wire brush if it's really bad, but any degreaser, paper towel, rag, anything like that should do the trick. Just to get it, all of that grit out of there. And it was disgusting, so. And now that we're cleaned up and ready to go, there's two ways, like I said earlier, that you can put these in with having no specialty tools like a bearing press or anything. I'm gonna show you both ways just so you can see what's gonna work best for you. I already touched on using a socket or some sort of OD that matches the outer bearing race, so that way you can drive it in with a hammer. The other way is using some sort of long bolt. This is actually the motor bolt for my RME conversion, and a washer setup. So when you do this, you're basically looking for, you're gonna put the bearing, the washer on the outside, the bolt, then washer, then bearing, and then be able to slide it in. And what that's gonna do is once you have a washer on the other side, you're basically acting as a manual press. So what it's gonna do is you're gonna be able to put the nut on, and it's gonna start, as you tighten this bolt up, it's gonna pull that bearing in. The important things to look out for here is obviously the same goal as with the hammer method, making sure that you find something that matches that outer race diameter. That is the most important thing with installing any bearings, is making sure you're only hitting the outer race, so that way you're not actually damaging the ball bearings, the cage, or the seals. So I'm gonna go ahead and do it with this method, but just so you know, this would be also another option, which is using long bolt, all thread, any sort of threaded bolt, any sort of threaded really material, nuts, and some sort of washer on it. So now that we have this cooled down, go ahead and install it. Just to touch again, they are 6002 RS bearings. You do need quantity 4 because there's 2 that go on each side. So make sure when you're ordering, you don't just order 2 and say, yep, that's all we need like a wheel. It is 4 bearings. So let's go ahead and get them back in. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, guys, is when you are installing them, you're gonna have to use a little bit of heat on the jack shaft again just to get them in. A little bit of expansion, heat's gonna cause it to expand. Same concept as when we removed them. A little bit of expansion, they're gonna be able to easier in and out. The other thing I forgot to mention is any sort of bearing, a quick way to get them to install a lot easier. Throw them in the freezer, throw them in the cooler, throw them in whatever you can to get them cooled down. That's gonna allow these to shrink up a little bit, and as long as they have that, they usually aren't too hard to get in. Some of them we get lucky and they just drop right in, and then as they obviously equalize in temperature, they tighten up on the tolerances. So something to keep in mind to make your install easier. Let's see how lucky I get on this one. So even just palming it with my hand, it almost installed all the way. I just would probably need a tap or two, and this thing's gonna go right on in. When you hear that difference in sound, you know it's all the way seated. Now this side is all the way done. The only thing we're gonna need to do is our seals. I'm gonna do those at the end, so that way we can show you on the other side. On this side of the jack shaft, since we put this side in first side it doesn't matter, you're just getting the bearings in. On the second side, you must remember your spacer so that you don't damage your bearings. So we're good to go. You wanna check so you can see in here, if once these spacers in, you'll know if your bearings are all the way seated. If when you push this all the way in, it's almost flush with this lip. So if it's not flush with that lip, let's say it's way deep in there, you know these bearings aren't seated all the way. Usually if you get that different sound on that last hit, you know they're seated all the way because that's gonna be metal on metal contact. But something you wanna check for so that we don't have to redo any of the work you did before. So now we can put these in. What you see that I'm doing without this right now is I noticed that this started driving in at a little bit of an angle. You can use just the straight hammer so that way you're not hitting everything and you're just basically at an angle, barely glancing on the outer race, and that's just to level it up. So that's a trick you can have if it starts walking in at an angle. Just lightly tap that outer race at an angle with the hammer, that way you're not getting any of the seal or the inner race again. Now that it's back leveled up, now we can drive her in. Now what I like to do before I do a final hit, because I do have it a little loose still, is line this inner spacer up. You're trying to get this to sit on just to where you don't have any overhang on the inner bearings, so that way that jack shaft slides in nice and easily. So you just try to lightly line it up, so that way when you get that last hit on the bearing, it's not going to be offset. And now it's held in there tightly. So, one more step on the outer one, same process. Changing sound, that means it's in. So, now we're ready to go ahead and move on to our seals, which are the 2 that you removed originally. This one stayed in with the sprocket. I don't want to install it back with the sprocket. I'm going to take these off, clean them, and then re-lubricate them. The important part of this step is you want to use a waterproof grease. I have a Peak synthetic waterproof grease. Doesn't really matter the brand, but the important part is you're cleaning these and you're reapplying grease, because this is going to act as a water barrier once everything's installed to try to eliminate any water ingress into your bearings or jack shaft at all. So clean it up, and then we're going to go ahead and grease them. And when you're installing them, you shouldn't really need any tools as long as you grease them well. You should just be pressing them in with your hand. You can see that one went nice and easy. Grease on it, grease shot back out. You can wipe the excess away. Shouldn't need anything more than just your hands on those. On this side, you can see that when it's installed, it barely has any lip. So this one, we're gonna go ahead and put that sprocket side on first. This is our sprocket, our smaller rear drive sprocket. And the reason that is because on these sprockets, they actually have a ring here with a lip that steps to sit on the bearing itself. A, that's gonna make sure it's fully installed. B, that's actually the diameter of that seal. So you need to install this back before we can go forward. So let's get to it. Once again, the sprocket side had the long bolts. The pulley / sprocket side for the primary drive uses the shorter bolts. With anything round that's going into a surface, always crisscross applesauce. Do your pattern so that way you can make sure it's seated evenly. So, got that sprocket installed again. Now is where we're going to grease this and put our seal back in. Try to rub it all around the outside, put a good line on the middle as well. That should allow it to easily press in. Always make sure the O-ring, which basically it's a metal O-ring, that portion is going to be sitting towards the sprocket or towards the inside of the jack shaft. Flush side always up to the outside. Now we're going to wipe up our excess. The only step left to do now is going to be put back on your pulley / sprocket, depending on who you ask. And put back on your spacers. Now you notice I didn't really try to torque these real high. I let it spin in my hand, because now we're going to torque it now that we got everything kind of set up. Screwdriver, anything like that will work. You're just trying to keep it from rotating. You can also use a pry bar. We have one here. It's really just about making sure you don't allow it to rotate, so you can kind of use this as a leverage base. So you don't need a lot of torque on these. This thing only puts out like 15 to 20 pounds max, so there you have it. Jack shaft back in, brand new bearings, everything's got nice grease on it, lubed up. Final step, make sure you put your sprockets, your spacers in the right sprocket side. So obviously our long one was our rear drive, final drive sprocket. We had that marked with an S, and our belt drive, we had that marked with a P for the pulley. Install them back in, and I guess I should just hand this over to Bullet so we can put it back on the bike. See you guys next time.